Fire Emblem is a long running series, and as such, it can often be hard to figure out where to start. With that in mind, I wanted to make a video to help out newcomers. Welcome back, Galeforce. I'm Gale, and today we'll be discussing which games are the best for newcomers. We'll be determining which is the best based on how simple the game's features are to understand or how well they're taught, the roster of characters in the game, the length of the game, and the quality of the stories. We'll be starting by talking about each game in order of release, barring Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light and Gaiden as they both received remakes that we'll be discussing in their stead, and New Mystery of the Emblem and Radiant Dawn as they are sequels to other games in the series. So let's get into it. Starting with Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War. This is a very divisive game in the community, with some swearing by it as the greatest in the franchise, and others absolutely loathing it. The truth is somewhere in the middle, I've found. The game's difficulty is a bit on the harder side, thanks to your playable cast of characters being relatively small at any given time compared to most other titles, as well as absolutely massive map sizes, which can sometimes be a slog to get through. The game has many features that are interesting, but scarcely, if ever, are they explained to the player. The roster of characters is charming, and the many hidden scenes that can trigger to see bits and pieces of their personalities add a nice reason to replay the game and try for different character pairings. The game may seem short, with only 11 chapters, but is actually exceptionally long for the franchise when considering the actual length of those chapters. Story writing quality is something of a mixed bag, with the lore of the world being some of the deepest in the series, but held back by how quickly it can be glossed over in the background. This is likely due to the limits of the hardware at the time of its release, but would be expanded upon somewhat in the next game in the series. Thracia 776. This is a game that I do not recommend playing without a guide, as you'll find yourself missing damn near half the game. The game has several features that it doesn't tell you about, including an unlockable easy mode that doubles your experience points that you can only get by entering a code, movement stars, fatigue, the capture system, and a version of Fog of War that only appears in Thracia. Thracia's characters are quite well written for the most part, though a select few of them are absolutely heinous. Thracia is also one of the longer games to beat, owing to its difficulty, though this can be somewhat mitigated through constant use of the warp staff after attaining it. The story itself is very good, and will leave you feeling frantic and afraid for leaving his friends at every new turn. It expands upon certain parts of the lore of genealogy as an interquel, and does an excellent job of doing so. Next, we're on to Fire Emblem 6, The Binding Blade. This is the first game I'll say you can get away with playing without a guide the first time around, though you still may want one if you wish to do everything you can in one playthrough. The features of the game are not particularly well explained, but unlike previous games, are simple enough that they can be learned with a bit of trial and error for the most part. The character writing in Binding Blade is mostly quite good, with support conversations in this game providing a new way to interact with and understand the characters. The game is probably the longest to beat of the GBA trilogy, but nonetheless will take far less time on average than either Genealogy or Thracia. In addition, the writing took a serious shift here from the dark fantasy style of 4 and 5 into a more traditional fantasy role that works well but is a bit too simplistic. The story itself is fine, but nothing to write home about. Fire Emblem 7, The Blazing Blade, is next, and I've gotta say this is by far the game with the easiest mechanics to understand, as the game dedicates an entire mode, the first 10 chapters of the game, to explaining them to you. Its characters are all quite charming, with each having distinct personalities to the point where not a single one isn't memorable. The game's length is somewhat long, but only if the player wants to see the story from the different perspective of Hector, which is unlocked after beating the main game as Eliwood. The writing takes a turn here that many would say is a downgrade in quality, with a focus on a much smaller story scope. This works to the advantage of the character writing, but the overall feel of the game is less grand as a result. However, the same can certainly not be said for Fire Emblem 8, The Sacred Stones. Much like Fire Emblem 7, the game features a tutorial that explains the basics, though it is much less involved than the previous games. Still, it does a decent job of teaching you the basics. Every character in this game is very well written, likely owing to the relatively smaller cast size of the game, and the length of the game is roughly the same as a single playthrough of Fire Emblem 7. This makes it the shortest game to complete in the GBA trilogy, which is only compounded by the lack of bonus chapters in this game. The writing of the story, much like the writing of the characters, is some of the best in the series here, with every piece of groundwork laid early on paying off in huge ways later. Next up, Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. This game also features a very short tutorial explaining the basics of combat, so it's got no trouble introducing newcomers in that sense. The characters are, for the most part, well written, though they can occasionally be a bit too cartoonish for my tastes. The length is far longer than the GBA trilogy, though this is mostly owed to the switch to 3D and the game's sluggish models. When in menus, the games flow with a relatively decent speed. It is only combat itself that takes so long. The writing of the story is where Path of Radiance really shines, with its simplistic coming of age story resonating much more with most fans of the series thanks to Ike being the first main character in the series to not be royalty. Skipping Radiant Dawn, we move on to Shadow Dragon. This remake of the original game does a great job of teaching the basics through tutorial chapters that weren't around in the game's original release. These chapters aren't around on harder difficulties, allowing you to experience the story in a slightly more traditional way. The characters are all rather one note, as they were in the original game, and the game itself is also rather short. The story, however traditional it may be, is still handled decently though, and you can get a fair bit of enjoyment out of it. Skipping New Mystery, we move on ahead to Fire Emblem Awakening. This game is often called the game that saved the series and is quite friendly to newcomers. The basics are taught in an easy to understand and intuitive way. However, this is the part of the series where the characters started to become significantly more cartoony, which can certainly turn some people off to the game. Naturally, the story itself is also much more like something you'd read in a manga than traditional FE fare, though not lacking charm itself. The game's length varies wildly by how much you want to engage with its marriage system and tackles its paralogue chapters, but the actual story itself is relatively short. Next, we have Fates. Fates is actually three games in one, those games being Birthright, Conquest, and Revelation. The basics of the game are explained fairly well, but the game utterly jumped the shark here when it comes to its character specific writing, with most of the cast being much more defined by specific character traits rather than having fleshed out personalities. Still, there are a handful of diamonds in the rough. Each game clocks in at around the same amount of playtime, with Conquest being slightly longer than the other two, though not by much. The story writing in Fates varies by route, with Birthright being okay, Revelations being bad, and Conquest being downright awful. Next up is Fire Emblem Echoes, a remake of Fire Emblem Gaiden. It features many systems that aren't seen in any game before or after, including dungeon exploration. These systems are sparsely explained, but are intuitive enough to get the hang of relatively quickly. Character writing is some of the best in the series here, and it reflects in the story. The length can be somewhat challenging for newcomers, though, as this game is undeniably lengthened quite a bit by some late game difficulty spikes and the occasional confusing dungeon. Next, we have Three Houses. This game introduced a plethora of new features which were all fairly intuitive if poorly explained. The character writing is the crux of Three Houses and where the game really shines. The length, however, is where some players may struggle with the game. There are four different paths you can play in Three Houses, but in order to play each, you must repeat roughly the first half of the game first. And Three Houses is not a short game. The story writing itself is fine, though certainly not perfect, and the game is mostly held up on the shoulders of its character writing and how they interact with the story. Finally, we have the latest entry in the series, Fire Emblem Engage. Engage introduced a lot of cool new features to the series, which does an okay job of explaining as the game goes on. The character writing in the game, however, is really, really bad. The game itself is decently long, and its story and characters will not help you to make it feel any faster. The gameplay itself is where this game shines. So, which of these games would I actually recommend for a newcomer? I'd have to say either Fire Emblem 7, The Blazing Blade, or Fire Emblem 8, The Sacred Stones. Both of these games offer tutorials that do a good job of explaining game mechanics to newcomers, with 7 practically holding your hand through it for the first 10 chapters. Meanwhile, Fire Emblem 8 has a training location your units can access to guarantee they're always ready for the next mission and allowing the players to essentially decide the difficulty of the next chapter for themselves at any time. Mechanics in both are widely used throughout most of the series as well, meaning instincts learned here will serve them well in every game going forward. But what do you think? What game would you recommend to a first time player? Whatever your thoughts may be, feel free to let me know down in the comments below. And if you like this video, shoot me a like and subscribe if you're looking for more content like this. A special thank you to my patrons 60 Sweep and Gorilla Danny for helping to keep this channel running financially. And with that, until next time, Gale Force out.